Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us. This is Risk Management 101, more interesting than you think. This webinar is presented by Jack Bliscoe, and the webinar is an overview of risk management and how an increased awareness of risk can help your organization. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A or the comment section in the platform, and Jack will hopefully be able to answer a lot of them during the presentation. But if not, we will leave time or stay over for questions and answers afterwards. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Jason. My name, as he said, is Jack Bliscoe. I've got over 42 years in the insurance and risk management industry, and another 5 years, 6 years after retirement of being in this field on a part-time basis. We're going to talk a little bit about risk management, kind of get your idea of how things are going with it, what it's all about. So let's get into it. Okay, Jason, my arrows are not showing to page.
Try using your left and right.
Oh, there it is. I got it. Found it. Okay. So risk management, if you don't do anything, it'll manage itself, but you're not going to like the cost of it. Losses can be expensive. Obviously, the best ones are those that don't happen, but that's not reality. Losses will happen. The next best is those that can be contained through a number of methods, which are collectively known as risk management, which is what we'll talk about today. So the takeaway from this slide is you're far better off if you manage the risk than taking your chances. So let's talk about what risk management is. I'm going to read you a definition, and then I'm going to highlight a few things from it. Risk management is a systematic method for the identification, analysis of pure loss exposures faced by an organization or individual, and for the selection and administration of the most appropriate risk control techniques and risk finance method for treatment. So highlighting those, identification of exposures. What exposures do you have? Obviously, if you're a city or a county, you have police exposures, you have fire exposures, you have road exposures. Those are the types of things that you want to try to address. Then you analyze them. How much of an exposure are they? If you have roads that have sharp turns on them, they're a bigger exposure than one that's a straightaway, for example. And then finally, what risk control and finance techniques can you use to treat those exposures? Keep in mind that risk is actually uncertainty due to some kind of a financial loss. If there's no uncertainty, there's no risk. So keep that in mind when we're talking about risk. So there's a couple of techniques we can use. Now, this is generic to all industries. So when we're talking about risk control and we talk about avoidance, as a public entity, there's not much you can avoid. There are a few things, like, for example, if you have a city or county pool, you could sell that off to a private vendor and let them run it. You do not have to provide a pool to your community. But loss prevention and loss reduction are things you can do. Separation and duplication are things you can do, in that I'm sure all of you back up your computer information on a nightly or at least weekly basis and then have it stored off-site. That would be a risk control technique, so that if something happened, you would have the information you could bring again. We will be talking about risk finance. Most of you probably have some self-insured retentions, which is the top part of that. And we'll talk a little bit about transferring. Many of you are in pools. Pools are kind of like insurance, but not quite. It's kind of a hybrid between retaining and insurance, and I'll address that in a little bit. So risk management involves 7 basic management technical competencies, as are shown on this pie chart. If you take the risk management practitioner program, which we'll be addressing a little bit later, all of these will be identified for you, but these are all the areas that risk management is involved in. I'm sure most of you are familiar with risk pools, and many of your risk pools are JPAs, Joint Powers Authorities. We use them because traditional insurance turned its back on the public sector back in the late 70s and early 80s. Insurance companies either wouldn't insure public entities, or they dramatically increased the cost. I heard of one entity down in Southern California who from year 1 to year 2 had a 6-fold increase in premium. This is where the insurance just wasn't available, and public entities started to get together to pool. Public entities have unique exposures. Most entities do not have things like police and fire, probably not even roads. And so these are unique exposures, and the traditional insurance market wasn't used to handling those, and they couldn't put them in with everybody else to try to have it be homogenous. And so they kind of walked away. Now they're back and wanting to get the business, but that was a problem back then. So JPAs were developed, a law was passed that allowed them, and they were expanded to pool the risk for public entities. So why is risk management so important? There's a very high cost to breaking things and hurting people. And these are the main areas we talk about: property and injury of people. Understand that it's not just the bills related to the damages. In property, there are things like loss of use or cost of continuing services, costs from downtime, cost of relocation, and possible cost of clientele loss. For bodily injuries, you have, in addition to the medical bills, you have wage losses, possible reduction in future wages, possibly death costs, costs of loss of support, both financial and emotional, cost of additional services, and prosthetic devices such as wheelchairs and crutches. So it gets very expensive in dealing with all of these items. What is the cost if you don't do it? Well, you have increased accidents, more absences, and complaints about your service increase. You have decreased morale in your organization, less productivity because of people either addressing the injuries or the accidents or not being there. You have decreased staffing in key areas. And think about police, fire, and teachers. What happens if one of those is gone? And then you ultimately have decreased customer service, which relates to the increase in complaints on the left side of the slide. For liability claims, you get more claims, obviously. If you don't manage your risk, more claims come in, and those have costs. The more you have, the higher the verdicts, because it shows a pattern of indifference, that you're not doing something to make things better. If you have a trip and fall on a sidewalk that just settled in a earthquake or something, that's not going to be so bad. But if you leave it there for 2 years and you have 6 trip and falls, those verdicts are going to get higher because of your indifference to the situation. Defense costs. I did a study a number of years ago. Many of you are familiar with CSEC EIA, that's now known as PRISM. I was working there as the chief claims officer there. And I did a study of 6 years worth of costs in liability side, and determined that of those defense costs, 29% of those costs were defense costs, and the remainder was liability indemnity payments. Understand when I'm talking about defense costs, I'm not talking about third-party attorneys' costs on those cases where those are eligible. So that's in addition to that. This was on $100 million worth of payments. So that's a lot of money that could be used for other things if you didn't have these claims, you handled them better. Third-party attorneys' fees, as I just mentioned, those are payable on civil rights and FEHA claims and such type claims. There's negative press coverage, and we see that today, all sorts of things. Look what's happening in a lot of cities where there have been shootings or other bad injuries, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all of those. There's a lot of negative press coverage about those. And that can lead to a poor reputation for your organization. And obviously that's not desirable. One thing about that poor reputation, your city council or board of supervisors is not happy about that, and they're not happy about the complaints they're getting, which adds more pressure on you. For workers' comp, you have increased accidents, which means more absences. And more absences equal more temporary disability costs. So those are direct costs that are going to affect your premium and your loss exposure for your organization. You're going to have less productivity because of those absences. And not only do you have the absences affecting productivity, but somebody's got to deal with the issue of the claim, the workers' comp claim. Somebody's got to deal with getting the person to the doctor, monitoring when they're able to come back to work, Do they have the appropriate medical release and so forth? So they can't be doing other things. So you have less productivity. And you have a decrease in customer service because of the fewer people. So one of the things to consider in workers' comp is, should you settle with a compromise and release, or a CNR, versus a STIP with stipulation? I kind of go down a soapbox about these and say you should settle with a CNR. When you settle with the STIP, the medical continues, and medical keeps going up, and the amount you have to reserve keeps going up, because reserves are set on life expectancy times the last 3 years of work, or last 3 years of bills. Those last 3 years of bills may stay the same, but every year you live, your life expectancy gets longer, so you actually have to reserve more. With the CNR, you settle that all out. So consider closing those out. We had an actuarial study done at CSAC EIA, and they determined that when cases close, the outstanding incurred comes down 23%. So that's a lot of money that could be used for other sources rather than leaving them open to pay medicals. So you look at things as a business decision, maybe. What's the cost of settling versus cost of defending? An early recognition of, is this a case to settle or defend, can save you lots in defense costs. I would see cases where hundreds of thousands of dollars had been spent, and then they say we should settle this case. And my question was always, why didn't they make that decision earlier on? If it's a case to settle, if it's a case you're not going to defend, then don't spend the cost getting ready for litigation. Try to get the case settled. You need to do due diligence for agency resources. What's it going to cost us in people and time to handle this claim? There will be some political considerations. So that's a reality of public entity. You do need to send a message occasionally to say, we're not just going to pay every time you bring a claim. I'm sure many of you are familiar with attorneys who are constantly bringing claims against your organization. If you pay them all the time, they're going to keep doing it. If you make them work and go through litigation on the appropriate claims, they may be a little bit more discreet about what they do. You are going to deal with department resistance, especially with police and sheriff's departments, where they say we did nothing wrong. And, they may be right that they did nothing wrong, but the question is, how is a jury going to see it? A jury may not look at, we followed procedure properly and we did everything right. They may look at what happened, and there's going to be a lot of emotion, especially if a child died or a mother of a child died or something like that. So again, early recognition of cases to settle versus defend can be very cost effective for your organization. Remember, you extend the authority to settle and provide direction as to philosophy. It's not the attorney, it's not anyone else, it's you in risk management, or however you're structured, whoever that person is. You may have to get that authority from your board or some other person in your organization, but the attorney does not have that authority without you granting it to them. So, what are some tools to help you maximize your risk management efforts? Okay, we looked earlier at that chart, and we looked at financial risk transfer. That's where we're going to focus in this section a little bit. Keep in mind, you're not transferring the risk, you're transferring the financial exposure to that risk. We're also going to look at root cause analysis to try to determine what is actually the cause of this incident and what we can do to stop it happening in the future. And we're also going to look at loss runs and what those can tell you. So we saw this slide earlier. We're now focusing as the arrow points on the right-hand side of the slide, and specifically the bottom right-hand side. There's two primary transfer mechanisms, insurance and contractual transfer. And we will talk very briefly about insurance and a little bit more about contractual risk transfer. Again, a pool is kind of a hybrid between retention or self-insurance and insurance. It's like you're transferring, you are paying a premium of sorts to the pool to pay for claims. However, with an insurance company, once you pay your premium, you're done. They handle the claims. Maybe you have a deductible. With a pool, if they don't have enough money, they can come back and do an assessment. So that's why it's a hybrid between the two. Okay, so we're going to look at contracts and certificates of insurance. We're going to talk about what they are and what they are. Well, let's talk about the contract first of all. Every contract you have with a vendor probably has indemnification language and insurance requirement language in your contract. And so you need to make sure that they comply with that. The certificate of insurance is the mechanism through which they show their compliance. Who needs them? Pretty much any service you're having done by an outside vendor, you need a contract. And if you have a contract, and again, it requires insurance, you need a certificate of insurance to verify they're providing what they say they will, what they agreed to. How do you get a certificate of insurance? This is relatively easy. You get it from the broker of the vendor. The vendor doesn't provide it, their broker does. It's a standard practice with commercial enterprise, and you almost always can get it. The only time it would be an exception is if you had an individual who just has like a homeowner's policy and a auto policy, a personal auto policy. They may not be able to get you a certificate of insurance, but anyone else can get that, and it's an easy thing to do. If they say they can't get it, then they just don't understand the process. So how can a certificate of insurance help manage risk? If your vendor's not insured, any loss exposures may become yours. So making sure that they have insurance is critical to your organization when you're dealing with a vendor. It indicates what coverage they have and who, meaning what insurance company is providing that coverage. In workers' comp, if they don't have insurance, those employees who get injured may become what's called statutory employees of you because you're having the work done. So it is really, really critical to get the certificate of insurance to verify the information that they agreed to in the contract. So let's talk about root cause analysis. I'm sure you would all agree that this is not a safe process. So, but why did it happen? Is it because Johnny, assuming Johnny's the guy at the top of the ladder, that he wasn't careful if he fell and got injured? And is the solution that Johnny needs to be more careful? Or is there more at issue here? Under root cause analysis, you want to look at what is the actual problem, determine the causal relationships of that problem, figure out, going back to Johnny, you got two people holding the ladder. So it's not just Johnny involved here. These two people are okay with this process too. So what are the relationships? Try to identify effective solutions that would stop this from happening, and then implement and track the solutions. We're going to discuss this more in what's called the 5 whys analysis, and that you'll see that in a minute, and how that helps you get to the root cause of the problem. One thing to keep in mind, and there's something called enterprise risk management, and that's looking at the organization as a whole and risk as a maybe an obstacle to reaching the organization's strategic goals. And if you look at it from that standpoint, rather than just it's the risk department's problem or it's that department's problem, and not thinking about how it could affect other departments, is a better, more global way for the organization to look at risk. So we're going to talk about one of the tools that's available, which is called the 5 whys analysis. And as it's titled, it's going to be asking why 4, 5, 6 times to get down to the root. So if you have a situation where somebody's driving and their fleet car stopped, the first why is obviously, why did the car stop? Well, let's say it ran out of gas. I'm sure you can guess that the next question is, why did it run out of gas? Now, there's a lot of possible answers to this. It could be that the person driving the car didn't check to make sure there's enough fuel. But for the purpose of this analysis, we're going to say because the last person to use it didn't refill it. And the next why is, why didn't they refill it? I mean, I'm sure we've all driven rental cars. You have to bring it back full. Why are they not refilling the fleet car? Because they didn't know it was required. Well, why don't they know it's required? Because they're new and there's no policy or training on fleet use. They weren't told, like with a rental car, you need to bring it back full or at least notify someone. And Maybe these whys can have multiple answers. Maybe the fleet department didn't check. I used to drive a company car van pool, and when I was low on gas, I had to bring it in for them to fill it. I didn't go to the gas station, so I would have to tell them that it needs gas. So that's another possible answer to the why. And why is there no policy or training? Because no need perceived. This is an issue that comes up in many different areas, that the need is not perceived, um, looking forward of, will people do it? I'm sure you've all seen ladders and hair dryers and so forth, and they have warnings on them. Those warnings are because a claim happened. And before that claim happened, there was no warning because there was no need perceived. Um, People will do some crazy things. You need to anticipate what's going to happen. Like that, someone may bring the car back low on gas and not fill it, and the next person may not look at it, and then they're stopped out in the middle of nowhere with a car out of gas. So this is a concept of the 5 whys analysis to help you get to a root cause. And the root cause is we need to understand that we need to have policy and training on many areas, even ones we don't think should be necessary. Loss runs. What is it? How do you use it? Um, you get this from your broker, from your third-party administrator. If you handle claims yourself, your claim system should be able to run you a loss run. Maybe you have access to the TPAs and you can run the report yourself. But this is something you should be getting on a regular basis. Um, it provides information about claims that have happened for your organization. A loss run can be run to any standards you want. You could get it for a specific year. You could get it for all losses, all open claims, all closed claims. But you can get it in many different formats. But it gives you the general information of where does it fall for coverage, what do they have a claim number, who's the claimant, a short description of what happened. The primary cause description is kind of a standard coding issue. And then you're going to find the amount of money that's out there, what's reserved, what's the percent responsible, and what's the paid amount. In some lines of business, you have the total amount split out. For example, in workers' comp, you'll have medical and indemnity, or possibly medical, TD, and PD, things like that. But it gives you some information. What you want to use it for is to see what claims are costing you, to analyze where the costs are applied. Sometimes, between losses and expenses, for example, but sometimes you want to charge this back to a department. So it's important to know what department was involved. And you want to use this to identify claim trends. If you look at this, there's only 6 claims, but you've got 2 of them that involve harassment, sexual harassment, and 2 of them that involve bikes. So those things may be trends, and you may want to look at those and see if there's something we need to do from a training standpoint, from any other standpoint. Somebody's asking about loss reserves. That's money that whoever's handling your claims puts up to figure what they think the exposure is on the claim. So that's what a loss reserve is. They should be split out by expense and indemnity, and then maybe even further than that. A couple of fundamental questions for you, if you're involved with risk, to know is, where is risk handled internally? My bet would be it's handled in various departments. Some of it's going to be handled in human resources. You may have a risk department that handles some of it. If you have a fleet, you may have a fleet department that handles some of it. And then you may have a general counsel or a city attorney or such that handles some of it. It's going to be spread out. Do your loss runs tell you what you need to know? If you're not getting the information from your loss runs that you need to know, go back to your claims handler and tell them what you need to know. And please be very specific, because if they have to guess what you want, they're not going to give you what you want. I had somebody ask me for a loss run for all claims for, I think it was like 2005. Yeah, 2005. And if you ask me for that, the question is, are there ones with a date of loss during 2005, ones that had money paid during 2005, ones that closed during 2005, ones that opened during 2005? I mean, there's a number of different permutations of a claim run for 2005. So you need to be very specific as to what you want. Who are your external partners? Some of them are going to be like I've been talking about, your broker, your third-party administrator on claims, your attorneys. Those are all external partners. Your vendors are external partners. You need to know who these people are that may be able to help you with respect to risk that's affecting your department and your agency. And there may be others, brokers, TPAs, JPAs, and so forth. And how is your relationship with those external partners? You want to have a good working relationship, especially with your broker and your TPA, and if you're in a JPA with them. You need to have that because that's going to help you control your loss, identify your loss, and they may have trainings that help you deal with your losses. So with that, I'm going to go to questions and any observations you have. Jason, have you been noticing any questions along the way?
I just have, what does C and R stand for again?
Compromised and released. That's one of the ways of resolving a workers' comp claim. I see Sergio asked, what is IBNR? IBNR is incurred but not reported. It's an actuarial concept that comes to you that affects your premium that you're going to be charged or your exposure that's going to be addressed. What it refers to is if you look today, all claims that have happened against your organization may not have been reported to you yet. So they're incurred, but they're not yet reported. And so actuaries will look at your experience and say, how long does it take claims to come in? So if I'm doing an actuarial report on you as of today, I know that there's a certain amount of money that's still out there, not reported, that will affect your exposure. Incident files, those are just notices. Those don't really go in the loss run. You can put them in, but don't need to. And could we conduct a training on how to read an actuarial report? We can pass that up the line. We would want an actuary to do that because I could probably touch it, but I'm not really qualified for that. Are there any other questions in plain English for the actuarial report? Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. Actuary, what they do is they predict the future based on the past. I have an actuary friend who says it's like driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror because he's predicting what's coming up ahead based on what he sees behind. They do a job of seeing what your exposures are, what your experience has been. They also factor in things like changes in the law, changes in jury verdicts that predict what things are going to cost in the future so that you can know what your exposure is. They're valuable, but yeah, sometimes plain English is not part of their repertoire. So I'll pass that up and see if we can do something like that. Anything else? So I don't know, Jason, do you want to touch this or do you want me to touch this?
No, I can kind of tee it up and then
okay.
You can. So after the end of this webinar, I will send out the slides as well as the webinar recording. I know it's a lot of information sometimes to digest. But if you're interested in more about risk management, CPS HR has a hybrid learning risk management practitioner program. I'll also send a little link on that as well, and you can kind of go over the classes that we have coming up. Yeah.
And just to explain the hybrid learning, in this environment where we're not doing in-person classes, there's part of it you do on your own as e-learning, and then you come in for a 2-hour virtual class where the instructors, some of them are, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's another guy, will answer your questions and give you some additional detail, expand on some of the topics that were presented in what they call the e-learning. You can see the topics. The first one's an overview of the more detail of what we did today. Then there's one on specifically on insurance administration, review and risk transfer. You get into the contractual risk transfer and so forth in much more detail, the certificate of insurance in more detail. Then there's one that's specifically on property and liability claims and a little bit on safety and loss control. There's one on workers' comp. And then finally, there's one on disability management and early return to work. If you take all 5 classes, you get a certification of risk management practitioner. And the people who take these classes think they're very helpful. So you might want to consider it.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so much for attending. Thank you very much, Jack, for presenting. It was a pleasure. Hopefully, everyone left a little bit more educated on risk. And like I said, I will follow up with an email with a link to the RMP program, as well as a link to this recording and the slides. So have a great day, everyone, and stay safe out there.
And Jason, one just last comment is on the slides. If you look at them in notes view, you can see some of the notes I had, which give you more detail to the slides.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.